Welcome to our broadcast. Critic John Leonard calls her, quote, the best writer working today in America. But Toni Morrison did not even start until she was 30 years old. Now, after 6 novels, a Pulitzer Prize, and a National Critics Circle Award, her critical prose and her lyrical prose is widely hailed. She writes about love and sex, black and white, men and women, from the mother and beloved who kills her 2-year-old child to save her from slavery, to the Harlem man in jazz who kills his young lover. Morrison's characters are haunting and unforgettable. She now teaches at Princeton University, and Jazz, her most recent novel, is just out in paperback, and we are very pleased to have her here. Welcome.
Thank you.
When you think about all the things that they say, I mean, she may be the last classic American writer squarely in the tradition of Poe, Melville, Twain, and Faulkner, and all the nice things that's been said about you. When you look back to Lorain, Ohio, and your mama, and your papa, and your brothers and your sisters, do those experiences shape what you write today? The music, storytelling, what you learned, what they gave you?
Very much. I'm completely informed by that community, by my extended family, the language particularly, not just the survival, but the way they spoke. You know, the language of average, poor African Americans is always discredited, as though it was impossible for them to speak or they were stupid. But there was this incredible merging of new language and biblical language and sermonic language and street language and standard that created a third thing for me.
A third thing?
A third kind of way of expressing yourself. They pulled from all the places. And that's what I tried to incorporate in my
Your
books.
mother loved music.
Oh, yeah, she's a powerful singer, powerful singer.
And you didn't inherit that musical talent.
No.
But you inherited, by osmosis, a sense of loving music. And every, I mean, gospel infuses beloved.
Oh, yes.
Jazz infuses jazz.
Yeah. It was not entertainment for us, you see. I woke up to the sound of my mother's voice. And it was information. I knew her mood. And it was a support system for us. It wasn't something where you went in order to feel good and then you came back. It was real information. It was powerfully influencing on me.
There was this tradition of storytelling as well, to pass on. Have we lost that?
I hope not. It's done professionally now, you know.
Right, it is. You see these professional storytellers.
Right, and now there's, books on
place.
tapes and so on. But in those days, it's pre-television, of course, even pre-radio. I remember life without a radio. And when adults sat around and told stories, and more importantly, or equally as important, at some point we were invited to tell stories also. And that's a major performance for a child, to be able to repeat a story with a little variation, your own, for adults, in order to get, if it's a ghost story, to make them shiver again.
To watch them enjoy your performance.
That's right. So that was a very important part.
Who gave you the gift or the interest or the curiosity about reading?
Well, there was a story in my family that privileged my grandfather because he was unable to go to school in Alabama. He was very young, born before 1865, and learned how to read from his sister. So there was this incredible awe of him because he had taught himself to read with his sister, and because he had read the Bible through 3 times, and he read all the newspapers, and this was, something with a great deal of respect and awe. And also, even though we didn't have a lot of books, we were encouraged to read. I don't remember life
without books.
Before I could read. I don't remember myself before I understood language, even, written on the pavement or on walls and so on.
Did you show gift then?
Didn't look like gift to me. I was one of those, everybody in my family could play music without music lessons, and they couldn't read music, but they could sit down and reproduce it.
By ear.
They sang, that's right, by ear. They sent my sister and I to take violin lessons and piano lessons. So I thought I was deficient because why did I have to go learn these things that everybody else could do naturally, so to speak? No one ever told me that this was a good idea to be able to read music. So being able to write or tell stories, I mean, it took me a long time. Even when teachers said nice things to me, I thought that the only reason other people didn't do that was because they weren't interested in it. It never occurred to me that there was anything exceptional about whether, you know, my writing and so on. It does now. But at that time, it just seemed like something I was interested in.
When you went away to Howard and then to Cornell, did you dream of teaching or writing or what?
Oh, teaching.
Teaching.
I wanted to be a teacher, and I was. And I did that as a young adult. I mean, when I left graduate school, I taught at Texas Southern University. Then I went to Howard University again as a teacher and stayed there until I couldn't stay there any longer.
Because?
I didn't have a PhD. And you have to, you know, in those days they even let you come in without a PhD, not anymore.
Then you went to Random House in Syracuse?
Yeah, I became an editor, textbook editor.
Had the dream of writing come in yet? You then came to New York and rose as an editor at Random House, teaching on Friday.
I rose, but
you
I
were
stayed.
But you were teaching a little bit too on Fridays.
Yes.
You go to teach at Yale or Rutgers or wherever. Teaching creative writing or teaching what?
I taught creative writing.
Yeah. Now, when did the dream come, though, to put it down pencil to paper?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you this, but I didn't even call myself a writer until after my third book. After Song of Solomon, I began
so
to...
it got critical good reviews.
Well, I knew that was central to my life after I had written the first book, The Bluest Eye. I mean,
what
I
did
knew
it tell you about yourself?
that I was an ill-advised woman who could not say, like the big guys, I am a writer. I always said I am a teacher who writes or an editor who writes, but I never said the real thing until after I'd written a third book. It's the sort of thing that women frequently do. They sort of need permission to tell themselves that this is the work they do. Even when I wrote The Bluest Eye,
The first book.
I was really writing a book I wanted to read. I mean, I didn't know, I hadn't seen a book in which black girls were center stage. They were usually, I don't know, somebody's joke or on the periphery.
You were writing it for yourself, not for any audience. Not for African Americans, not for anybody, for yourself.
For me. I wanted to read it. I wanted to read a book that had no codes, no little notes explaining things to white people, no little clues, just something that I already knew and what was more provocative about it. And I had a major, major question in my mind at that time, which was, how does a child learn self-loathing for racial purposes? Where does it come from? Who enables it? How is it infectious? And then what might be the consequences?
And what were the answers?
You learn it from the society at large.
Institution,
but more importantly than that, at a certain time, the self-loathing can be reinforced by one's own family, one's own community. You know, that the concept of what is ugly can just be reinforced by people next door. I remember girls who weren't blonde, who longed for that and felt terrible about themselves. I mean, all this physical beauty business is painful if you have to do what you do now, which is cut yourself up in little bits.
Most of us have no idea of the pain it causes people because the society and the culture and the media and the magazines and the television and all the commercials bombard them with what it is to be attractive. And they define attractiveness in our culture, and they find what's good and what's bad. So that all of a sudden, if you don't look like that, you say, I don't like myself.
Oh,
and how do I go change myself?
It's death. It's interior death. You never have an opportunity to develop what's really valuable, which is grace, balance, health, virtue, all those good things that each of us can be. But now, if you're going to worry about hair and skin color, how tall you are and how short, I mean, I don't mean that self-esteem is not bound up in some of these things, but I'm talking about obsessive.
Self-esteem is bound up in everything.
Yeah, we're sure. Yeah, it is.
So, excuse me. When you did, there must have come a point in which you realized you could write at least after Song of Solomon. And you said what? What was the joy? What was the excitement? What did it bring to you? What did it mean to you?
I could write long before
okay,
that.
But
I
what
thought
was
it was
success?
Really hot.
I mean, I guess you thought what?
I thought it was really hot. I thought it was really good.
Hot? Good?
Good, powerful.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That people wanted to read what you said.
No. I thought I was wonderful.
Oh, you were wonderful.
And I thought the writing was extraordinary and different and radical and beautiful. That's what I thought. I did not think that there would be a lot of people who would share that view. So I was never, ever convinced that I would have a wide readership. I always thought it would be, 400 other people who thought the same thing I did. And when that changed, and it changed with Song of Solomon, that was a commercial success. Right. There were lots and lots of people. I was delighted. And that's when I said, I called myself a writer, used a label. And what had preceded it was just a sense that the center of my intellectual life was that work. That's when I felt coherent, really as though I belonged here on this place.
To do this thing.
That's right.
What was the joy of it for you?
Finding out answers to these incredible questions that it seemed to me had never been put subtly. And if they had been, the language had not manifested it. I wanted the language to be what the question was. I wanted the language to simply hold it. I started my career with the bluest eye of putting the entire plot on the first page.
The entire plot?
The whole story is there.
So you know it.
So the reader reads the first page, he knows exactly what happened. And if he turns the page, it's because he wants either to find out how it happened or he loves the language.
And you hope for both of those things.
I hope for both of those things.
And those characters, you have said this before, that in each of these novels, one, Self-Loathing, there's a question you want answered.
How does that happen?
And how's that happen? What was the question as we move up Song of Solomon?
Song of Solomon was about this sort of political problem that young adults have, which is trying to combine upward mobility, middle-class bourgeois upward mobility, with some kind of respect and reverence for their ancestors. There's always this conflict, as though if you go to college, then you can't go back to Lorain, Ohio, or if you stay in Lorain, Ohio, you have to despise everybody who went on. Not quite that simple, but you understand what that tension is. So I was trying to figure out how somebody who's in his late 20s or 30s got educated, a man I chose, because I thought they sort of started from zero anyway, and what would help inform him to learn how to be a complete human being without these conflicts, without these self-destructive impulses for material things, gold, cars.
How do the characters come to you?
Well, I start with the idea, such as the one I described.
The plot.
The plot. And not the plot, the question.
With the question.
Right. And then I try to figure out what kinds of people can manifest that for me, can do that for me. Do I need men or women, or short people or tall people?
And what kind of conflict between them?
That's right. And set that up. And then I have to fully realize the characters and sort of love them without approving of them necessarily, but really love them. And my earnest desire is whomever they are, is to do them justice.
Beloved, what was the question?
The question was, who is the beloved? Who is the person who lives inside us that is the one you can trust, who is the best thing you are? And in that instant, for that segment, because I had planned several books around that theme, it was the effort of a woman to love her children, to raise her children, to be responsible for her children. And the fact that it was during slavery made all of those things impossible for her.
She couldn't do it.
She couldn't be a mother. Because, and there was this interesting historical incident, you know, the Margaret Garner story, in which that actually happened. There was a great deal of infanticide.
She killed her child.
In order to prevent her from living a life she believed would be intolerable. But that's her claim, you know, kind of a control that she was trying to exercise in order to be simply a mother, and that the best thing she was this lovely child, or these children. And of course, that set her on a very complicated, self-destructive journey. But the question was still there. And the answer, or at least the other question that's delivered, is when somebody asks her or tells her, no, no, you are your best thing. You are.
Is this journey painful for you?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Especially.
Oh, the slavery stuff was terrible, because it's one thing to sort of know historically, abstractly, conceptually, generally what it was like. But imagining that life, which is sort of entering it very fundamentally, is very, very difficult for me. And the only thing that made it really possible to stay there, you know, was just little things, just knowing that you couldn't see your husband in the daytime, only at night, only when the sun was dark, because people worked from sunup to sundown. The only thing that made it really possible for me was thinking, well, I didn't have to do it. I just had to imagine it. So I can't be too self-regarding and precious about all that. If they could do it, I can write about it. I mean, I could get tough enough.
You say that you found out, I mean, this notion that slavery existed for 300 years. And you gave it that time. And 60 million people died because of slavery.
I asked around, trying to get figures. Some people said, I don't know, less.
200 million. Some people said 10 million.
Yeah.
Some people said...
So if you think of the
like
Middle
a lot
Passage,
of people, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, you know, who kept records? But you look and see how many people died in those ships, how many people committed suicide, jumped off the boats,
Right.
how many people were rounded up and never made it to the ports, and then how many generations were cut off. You have, it's a nation, it's a real nation, nations upon nations who did not live. And of course, if you think that the people who did arrive and did stay alive were the strongest and the toughest, I mean, they lasted,
Yes.
then you have this race of these sort of giants here in the country. But what was really interesting to me was there was no lore about the Middle Passage.
Yes.
There were no songs about it. There were no poems about it. There are contemporary poems, but it didn't survive in spirituals and gospels except obliquely, as though these people had to do something extremely important, which was to forget that in order to get on with the next day. I mean, if you're going to survive and be around for your children, you just can't stay there. You just can't dwell there in the past. But that was a survivalist technique, but at the same time, it's as though those people have never been mourned properly.
Was it hard to come to another novel after Beloved and all the acceptance that it had and the Pulitzer Prize and say to yourself, because you write all the time, you write before 5 o'clock because you want to start writing before the sun comes up.
Yes.
You want to see the sunlight, the light of the early morning. You don't take vacations very much.
No, never.
Writing pretty much every day, I guess. But was it hard to say, what do I do now?
I knew the next idea was going to be the same question, who is the beloved, but with a male-female, you know, sexual encounter.
Passion.
That's
Yeah.
right, real passion, a sort of thing where you say, I can't live without you, and you really mean it. What does that mean?
There was a story. You saw there was a Harlem photographer named James Vanderlee or something.
Vanderzee.
Vanderzee.
Yeah.
And he'd taken a photograph,
Yeah, he took
a true story,
Yeah.
of a woman.
He took a whole slew of pictures of dead people for the bereaved family. Little babies in father's arms, and I don't know where that came from, but there was this whole world of dead people pictures, which they put on their mantles and decorated and so on. And there was this one girl lying in a coffin around 18 years old, and he describes how she died. And he says she went to a rent party, you know, one party, and she was dancing, and she slumped, and her friends thought she was sick, and they took her in the bedroom, and they saw blood. And they said, what happened to you?
She refused.
And she said, I'll tell you tomorrow. She knew what had happened to her. An ex-lover had come in and shot her with a silencer, and she wanted him to get away. And I thought, now that isn't the most romantic teenage passion. And to put it right in the jazz age, which is full of passion, romance, music, license, you know, black people in the city, empowered now. It just seemed an ideal story.
You don't write about in jazz the Harlem Renaissance. You're not writing about all the people who populate. You're writing about ordinary people.
Exactly. I didn't want to write about the stars of that period because, first of all, a lot has been written on that.
Right.
And also, I wanted the book to really be about the people who didn't know they were living in an era. I mean, the same thing was true for Setha in Beloved. She didn't know she was a classic example of something. These people think they're living in a large city, and they don't have the delight of the revisionism or the historical, just ordinary people. jazz was for ordinary people. Jazz is ordinary people. Jazz isn't even jazz. I mean, I never used the term in the book. I mean, it was it's the whole concept of jazz, of where it came from, what's the etymology. It's a very, suggestive source of word, and it always carries with it something illegal and illicit and risque. And also it's the music of the young. Yeah. Every time young people invent music, everybody hates it. I mean,
and then it becomes accepted cultural
That's
voice.
right, later, when they get old.
Yeah. Yeah. So you write about these characters, and then you now are in a position, you also write a couple of essays. You write an introduction to an essay about Clarence Thomas and the Thomas hearings, and also you give a series of lectures at Harvard. Have you come to the next question for the next novel? Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah.
Can you share it with me?
No.
No. Because you...
Well, I could share a little bit, but it's still... It's too early, Charlie.
All right.
It's too early.
If I look, August Wilson, as a playwright, is chronicling the African-American experience decade by decade. What are you chronicling in your novels?
Well, pretty much, I think in the last 3 books, the same thing.
Yeah.
Because even though I said I couldn't
Slavery
share this third
was
one.
defined by its own time. Harlem is the sharecroppers coming up in the 30s and 40s.
This next book, I can tell you, is later, but it relies on something that I think is not well known or treated fictionally. It's those all black towns that black people founded right after the Civil War. Hundreds of them, all over Kansas and I don't mean neighborhoods or townships, but complete towns with banks and schools and so on. And what happened to those towns?
And what did happen to them historically?
Some of them were raided and displaced by white people who either wanted the land or the depot. Some of them just fell on bad times because the cotton crash. But some of them fell on bad times because of what happens to towns like that, internecine battles for power and control.
Families against families.
That's right.
And people fighting for turf.
Yeah, so I'm going to call it paradise.
Paradise? Why paradise?
That's what they thought they were.
They thought it was paradise. Are you writing for now an audience? I mean, I read a story about a young man, a young African-American student who stands up at Princeton or somewhere at a lecture, and he says, "Who's your audience?" And you said, "You are my audience. I'm principally writing for you." Tell me who you're writing for. What did you mean to that young man?
Well, I reduced it to a cliche almost, which is to say, I want to write for people like me, which is to say, black people, curious people, demanding people, people who can't be faked, people who don't need to be patronized, people who have very, very high criteria. That seemed to me the way black people always were. I mean, you can't fake them out in music.
Right.
I mean, if you can't do it that way, you just can't be there. You can't fake them out in basketball. They always are reinventing the level of achievement, raising it, raising it, raising it. But somehow, so much of the literature, or at least the work about the literature, was depressing it, and writing sort of simple-minded stories, you know, the popular literature. And I wanted to have my work to be as complex, as intricate, as subtle as the music was, or anything else that black people did in a group. So that when I say I'm writing for you, young black man, or me, I am not marginalizing him, I am not making him peripheral. I'm saying this is very important, and I know your demands are high.
Are you, as you write this, trying to redefine for America how the African-American experience fits in the American history and the American experience?
That's good. That's exactly right.
I got it?
That's good. You got it right.
Give me an A. And you're at Princeton now, and Cornell is there, and others are there, and they tried to get Henry Gates, but they were from Duke, and they ended up at Harvard. And there is a powerful group of scholars and writers, and Cornell is a great friend of this broadcast.
Oh, yeah.
And this is part of an effort to say to us in America, what?
If you study the culture and art of African Americans, you are not studying a regional or minor culture. What you are studying is America. That the access, the route via the culture of the people in this country is interdisciplinary, it's provocative, it's reflective, and it's about you and me. Ralph Ellison already said it at the end of Invisible Man. This is not separate. Not only is African American culture and art not separate, it has impacted enormously on white culture, but neither is white culture. The book that I did, the lectures, Playing in the Dark,
Right.
was an examination
Lectures, right.
of how Melville and Twain and Hemingway and Flannery O'Connor and all of these people got, brilliantly or not, a lot of mileage out of wrestling with those questions about the presence of African Americans in this country.
Why has racism been so dominant in our life? What is it about African?
It's about feeling good. I mean, racists...
You need to feel that you are better than someone, and
Some
so
people do.
with every ethnic group that comes to America,
Oh,
it's
sure.
African Americans who they need to feel better.
Oh, yeah, they made some changes, but there was always, in other words, if a German or an Italian or whomever came to this country trying to Americanize himself, he could sort of stay with Germans or stay with Italians or stay with Irish people, which in fact frequently they did. But in order to become an American, to have consort with, easy relationships with people from other parts of Europe, the one thing that could unify you is that you were no longer an Italian. Now you're white. That was the unifying stroke. If all of those people from Europe, who weren't white in Europe, but they got white here,
And
that was the
that
lesson.
Gave them a unity.
That's right.
And it gave them a bond with a group. It gave them something that set them apart.
It became whiteness as ideology.
Tell me
you
the
see.
story of growing up and this young man who came there and didn't know epithets towards African Americans until he learned.
You mean in my life?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I was, well, this town I lived, this little steel town, and it was full of immigrants and black people and Mexicans and all sorts of people who were coming there for work because it was a steel town. And I remember being in the second grade, and I read before I came to school, so I was a fairly quick reader, and the teachers would frequently choose a student who couldn't read to sit next to me, you know, teaching the blind children or reading for them. And this young Italian boy came into class, and my last name was a W, so I sat in the back, and his was Z or something. Anyway, he was
Your
put
name was
next to me.
Wofford.
That's right, Wofford. And we were good friends. I taught him how to read. He was young enough to learn. He's very smart. And I remember the day, it was just like 6 weeks later, when he entered the class, and he couldn't sit next to me, and he couldn't speak to me, and he had learned in 6 weeks not only the word nigger, but what that meant and how disempowering it was for him to be my friend. It was shocking because I felt bereft, but I also felt that there was some trauma. I mean, I felt that later, that he had experienced. You know, if somebody says, oh, you know that person you used to like? Yeah. Well, that person is no longer worthy of those affections that you had. So you've lost your judgment, your instincts. You know, all of these things are separated. Now, if that happens to you, and you have some problems with national identity or religious identity or what have you, it's very comfortable to have a whole group of people who are unlike you, who you can surmise and hope are inferior.
Some would say, what about what about immigrants to this country from Latin America? Different skin color. Are they experiencing the same thing?
In some degree, I think so, yes. Some of them are very busy making sure that whatever their skin color, it's not black. That has been the case in most immigrant experiences. It's always Koreans versus the blacks, or the Dominicans versus the, but the only common denominator is black.
Right.
I mean, that's the engine that unifies this, and it helps you to enter into the mainstream, is this antipathy to the blacks. It used to be. Now I think probably less, because there's just too much idiocy connected with it.
Is there any answer other than education? And what is it going to take to lance and spill out all the poison of racism?
I have to come down on the side of education.
That's the only hope.
Well, there's a certain kind of moral leadership that could help. I mean, the contempt for poor people, the contempt for difference that is everywhere, in education, in politics, everywhere, is part, it's not just school responsibility. I mean, imagine raising your children to despise other people. Imagine living in a world in which you're perfectly willing to trash all of your big cities, to flush all of the big cities down the toilet because of the word inner city, which means those people who live there, or to trash your whole public school system, to sink it, in other words, because of the contempt for those people. One of the things I was trying to do in jazz was to try to recall what it was like when people went to the city, when big cities were the place to go. It didn't matter who lived there. It was the variety, the absolute knowledge that 10 blocks in any direction was that other person. But it was all right because there was some strength in numbers and nobody was simply trashing it.
You call New York the only great America, the only great city, right?
The last real city.
The last real city. Why?
Because you have real neighborhoods, real mixtures of classes, races, and so on, in parts of this, in large parts of the city.
You don't have it in Washington and Chicago and Los Angeles?
Aren't there little pockets there? You know, the neighborhoods are pretty much confined, it seems to me, and it's somewhat in this city too, in terms of the very rich and the middle class and so on. But you can still find in New York that organic quality, you know, in many neighborhoods.
Why is jazz the only book in which you've said it given a New York setting?
Well, I'm not a city girl, you know. I'm from a little small town.
That's right.
But I thought I could. I'd better put jazz in New York.
Well, you had to set it in New York.
Oh yeah.
When you think about the politics of America, you know, political leaders don't have the will to deal. The political will to deal.
I don't know about those guys. I mean, I'd be
where
befuddled by them. I'm really befuddled. I guess it's just power and power strategies, and I got mine and you get yours. You know, we talk now about the man who is now the president of the country. I hear people say he is going to have difficulty getting his health care plan through, or he is going to have trouble getting his stimulus. It's not his, it's ours. It's not a personal relationship. It's ours, or it's not ours. It's not his war against Bosnia. It's ours. So this confrontational, personal relationship with these leaders is really boring me a lot, because it's almost as though
we personalize the conflict.
That's right. As though we don't participate in it, although we don't have a share in it, except to criticize or to support in some very rudimentary, elementary, either-or way.
I want to come back to self-esteem and identity, because you said that Clarence Thomas, Justice of the Supreme Court, tried in an essay, what was it called? What was the name of the book? It was called Redefining American, what?
Raising Justice, Engendering Power, the Construction of Social Reality. Yes.
Was that your title?
No. I thought it was great. Nobody else agreed.
You said that he was trying to bleach his blackness. Isn't that too strong for Clarence?
I didn't say that, Charlie.
You didn't say that?
No.
Okay, I misread then. What do you think of Clarence Thomas and his experience? Because much was made of this African-American man who'd worked very hard. Do you think because he was a conservative, because he was a Republican, that somehow he had sold out, he had lost his identity?
My problem, my questions about him were not his being a conservative, but I thought that place ought to go to somebody who was brilliant. And all of the people who supported Clarence Thomas, nobody said, he's brilliant. We need, as though they couldn't find a conservative black justice who was brilliant. Now, all of the other things that happened about whether or not he in fact was, that what Anita Hill said was true about him, right, whether in fact he was a traitor to his race, those things were really quite secondary to me. I mean, they're important, but in my essay, I was trying to say, listen, there's a kind of process of rescue in which someone who has had dumped on him all of the terrible things that racism can bring about, and who makes an effort to deal with it. And even he said, you know, if you follow through on what happens to you as a black person, you either have to subscribe to violence or profit. Profit. Meaning if you're going to make it in the world, in the white world, you better give it up. That's right.
Your choice is either violence or profit.
That's right. Profit meaning upward mobility, right, conservative, or not even conservative, but certainly you're not going to emphasize your ethnicity.
But you believe in upward mobility.
Of course.
Right?
Absolutely.
Of course you do.
But I'm not going to give up one drop of melanin in order to get there. I'm not going to erase my race or my gender to get there. I want all of it. I deserve all of it, and we all do. I don't want to be blanded, bleached out in order to participate in this country and walk any hall of power or corridor that I want to. If I'm not good enough, if I'm not smart enough, then that's it. I'll take that hit.
Judge me by my deeds.
That's right.
Arthur Ashe was here, the late Arthur Ashe,
yes,
and he said to me, as he said at one other place, he said, in a much quoted comment, he said, living with AIDS is easier than living with racism. It's a harder struggle against racism for me than it is against AIDS. What it meant to me is that there's no way for the rest of us to understand that daily encounter. Which brings me to my question to you. Do you still have that encounter? Do you, Toni Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academe, etc., still have that encounter?
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose,
Right,
but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism,
right,
are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people, and possibly equal, as it does black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in these funny places, I couldn't go in the park.
You felt morally superior to them
I
from
did.
day one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was superior.
That's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, you know, of defensive racism.
And the victim is the other person who is morally inferior and
that's a
has
serious
to hold
question.
on to
Of course.
racism
if you
to
have
somehow
to hold, that's
for
right.
his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Then give white people some free advice.
They're all in my books.
And the advice is to come to grips
Of course.
with your own fears.
Absolutely.
Your own
Look at
fears.
it. Absolutely. Your own fears, your own history, and what you need. What do you need this for? You know, it's not, I said glibly a moment ago, well, it feels good. It must feel good, otherwise they'd give it up. It's wasteful,
right.
It costs a lot, it's ugly, it hurts. What are you paying for that for?
Driven by fear.
That's right.
Yeah. Give me your take on Rodney King in Los Angeles and all of that experience.
The most remarkable thing to me about Rodney King and what happened afterwards was people kept saying, oh, this terrible explosion, oh, the riots, oh, this is awful and could have been avoided, or what is it about? What struck me most about the people who were burning down shops and stealing was how long they waited. The restraint, not the spontaneity, the restraint. You realize the moment to be anarchic was when we saw those tapes. When we first saw those tapes.
They waited for justice.
They waited. How long was that? 9 months, a year?
Yeah.
They waited for justice almost a year and didn't come. No one talks about the fact that no one ran out into the streets as I wanted to. I was sitting in there with my son. It was like a ballet. It was unbelievable. And I think everybody felt that way. And no one, they didn't do a thing. They waited. That's amazing. That's amazing to me.
But what do you say to those of the same color who were damaged by that final explosion
How long do you think someone should wait for justice?
of rage?
Oh, well, that breaks my heart. I'm heartbroken about the crime that's inward, that turns inward within the neighborhood. There's an element of self-destruction that is there for all sorts of reasons, some of which are the ones we mentioned in the bluest eye, which is just self-loathing. Some is just cul-de-sacs. Some is just a world in which you cannot even be a man. Excuse me, you can't be an adult without money. You know, when I grew up, you could be a grown-up and poor. I mean, you could, I don't know, build a house or go hunting.
You made a point somewhere where the choices are awful.
They're awful. So they have to have things in order to have respect. So they steal things.
To get things.
Right. Or, you know, because they don't have things. So that's heartbreaking. And I'm very happy about what seems to be recently going on, which is, you know, some real examination of what can be done. That's a part of the history of black people. This is not a new thing, although some black neocons suggest that it is, which is...
You mean Thomas Sowell and people like that?
Yeah, as though, you know, self-help was something they invented last year. I mean, black people have always had charitable organizations, always help one another. I mean, that was always part of it. And then there was a decade in which they were demanding rights at a larger, from the government. But the whole business of self-discipline and the responsibility of adults for children, there can't be that kind of gap anymore. That's what's important, and that, it seems to me, I'm very optimistic about, I don't know, Ben Chavis being out there in the prop, and then this truce. I mean, those are good signs, because if it spreads like wildfire, for those young people particularly, who may be in a position now to instruct the older ones, I mean, the people not quite in my generation, probably in yours, about what, you know, what needs to be done. This is our work. This is our work.
Ben Chavis comes from a religious experience. He actually grew up about 10 miles from where I did. And he in Oxford, and I grew up in Henderson, and I now live near Oxford. Religion, has it served African Americans?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. There's a lot of ridicule about, I know, certain elements of the Christian church.
Being an opiate or something.
That's right. But, you know, it's always been a political organization for black people.
The only protector in many cases, way back.
Protector, and it was a place we could get together.
Yeah. And it was, Jesse Jackson once said to me back in '88 or one year he was running, he said, you know, the hardest thing for me, because the black churches had served him so well in his campaign, it was a place. He said the hardest thing for him to crack was white churches. Now, I don't know what he meant, but he just said that was the hardest place for him to go. And if you looked at the politics of '92, President Clinton scored heavily because he had the rhythm, it seemed to me. Don't you?
Oh, yeah. He was very comfortable
With scripture
and very at home with scripture.
And gospel.
He's a Baptist, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I don't know what he is, but yeah, I think he's a Baptist.
I think he's a Baptist. Anyway, he does have that easy access.
Yeah. Are you a religious person?
Mm-hmm. You don't want to go any further than that, do you?
I want to talk a little bit about your private life, and I know you look at me like, no, I don't want to talk about my private life. Only this. Was it hard for you to, I mean, a lot has been made about teenage parents, and you step forward and say, well, wait a minute, you know, there are a lot of grandmothers who had kids when they were 15, almost defending this, and a lot of people look at that, teenage parents who don't have, you know, money or
That's
a husband. Well, how about a
what?
man? How about a man there?
Well, it'd be nice, but the country says you can't have a man.
All right, but you raised your two kids. Your husband was an architect, left, and you had to raise your own two sons, right?
It's terrible.
It was?
It's very hard.
Yeah.
Awful.
So where did you call on to get it done?
My family. My brothers, my mother, my grandfather, my sisters. You know, my little saying is one person cannot raise a child. Neither can two. You need everybody.
Yeah.
You need everybody you know. And if I don't, that's right.
Supportive.
Well, I'll cry I didn't live in that neighborhood anymore. I lived in New York. I was working as an editor. I was running up and back and forth to Yale teaching. And I had these children. So I had to send them home in the summer. My family had to come. I had to keep very close touch with those people. And even so, it was difficult, very difficult. They're guys, after all, and willful. But that, you need everybody. And that's...
But it seems that there's a breakdown in that.
In what, the family stuff?
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
The family,
yeah,
in white, black, you know, in all
too bad.
cultures,
That's
it's
right.
happening, in Oriental cultures as well, a breakdown in family. And you can't have a conversation in America about family values because, and we're going to talk about this over the weeks in this broadcast, because of the notion that it's become politicized. You know, if Dan Quayle raises it, then it's, you know, it gives it a negative spin or whatever happens because of Murphy Brown. You fail to have an engaging conversation about what you just talked about. You couldn't have made it without family.
Yeah,
because you wanted to write and you wanted
Exactly,
to support
exactly.
and you needed to do things.
That's
You had your mother. Is your mother still alive?
Barely. She's
Barely.
ill, but she's around.
Yeah. They live in the South, or she?
In Ohio.
In Ohio. She lives in a small town, same town?
Sure, Lorraine, Ohio.
She's still there. She has an interesting first name. Was it Ram?
Rama.
Rama. Yeah.
Rama is a city. They picked her name out of the Bible like that. You know, he used to open the Bible and do like this. She got her name that way. She didn't like it.
Yeah. Who's had the most influence on you?
I think those two, my mother and my father,
Yeah.
for different reasons. For different reasons.
Has it turned out to be the life that you wanted when you look at where you are? Any regrets? Any?
Oh. Yes.
Like what?
I'm not going to tell you, but there have been a lot of regrets. We were talking earlier about family and the difficulty of describing it because there's so many labels. I mean, the language has got to change, but we just get family values means something very, very specific now. And what we define as a family is what is different. I am telling you, I'm a woman with two sons.
Right.
I'm a family, but I need a larger family. I'm not sure that a family has to be the mom, the dad, the two kids, and the dog and the cat. There are other kinds of...
In the station wagon and the pickup.
That's right. There are other figurations.
Yeah.
And what I needed was a larger configuration of a family. Sometimes you call it an extended family. But it was quite accessible to me. I could use it. They expected me to use it. My mother's one question when I moved to New York was, but you don't have any people there. And that's what she meant. And so we found some.
Yeah. Are you optimistic?
Sometimes. Most of the time I'm not.
Most of the time you're pessimistic about where we're all going as a society and why we've got so much.
Yeah, it doesn't look very good. I mean, it just doesn't look very good to me right along and through here. People are silly and misled, and they don't hear, and no one is willing to tell them, and they're so greedy. And even when they're not, they're ridiculed for not being that way. I don't know, there's no, I feel an absence of a heart. Under the worst circumstances, I may have been naive about this, but this always seemed like a big-hearted country, just big-hearted. Now it seems small and narrow. I hope I'm wrong. Sometimes, maybe had this conversation 2 weeks from now.
You'll feel better. Some might argue that that's because it's a troubling world out there, and while democracy, some would argue at the end of the Cold War, democracy has triumphed and our way of life has triumphed, so to speak, that all of a sudden they look around and now it's opened up all these other kinds of conflicts.
The world's not simple. The consequences of becoming a democracy are out there. We emphasize that part, but we're also a major capitalist and capitalistically formed country. And it's true of all of Europe. I mean, the slaves have come home from the plantation. The wars are still going on. The Cold War, they keep talking about these years of peace. Peace? What peace? They've been fighting 30 years of wars elsewhere. All the blood was shed in the Third World. Our confrontation with Russia, our confrontation with communism, there was no nuclear explosion, there were no, there was enough, but they still fought. I'm not so sure that these problems are not, what could have been foreseen, they're inevitable. You can't call those countries poor when they have all the tungsten in the world in 2 high schools. You can't call Latin America poor third world when they have all of the resources. I mean, the whole language is wrong. So yeah, we're gonna have problems, real ones.
I thank you. It's great to meet you. It's good to have you here for this conversation. Jazz, which was a national bestseller. Toni Morrison won a Pulitzer Prize for Beloved. Paradise is the name of the new book. I thank you very much. It's really great to have you here. I hope we can do this again.
This video raises questions, and I need for you to be extremely honest in the comments when answering them. And just so you know, I have 3 questions. Number 1, before this video, have you ever heard the name Toni Morrison? Number 2, have you ever wanted to write your story? And number 3, do you think your life would make a good movie? Now please be honest in the comments when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.